Coming to you from Guthrie City Hall, this is the Roundup.
Hello and welcome to the final installment of the Roundup. I'm your host, Chris Evans. Today, again, we are joined by Senator A.J. Griffin and Representative John Pfeiffer as we conclude the season here with the legislature finally wrapping up another year, another tough year for you guys, an unusual way because of the $1.3 billion shortfall, the largest in state history. Just going to get your guys' overall thought on the entire process.
Well, I'll start by talking a little bit about the budget and the way we handled it in the Senate. You know, when you're first elected, one of the things they tell you about and they warn you is that they're going to roll out a budget in the last couple of days. You're never going to have seen it and you're going to have to vote on it. And the first couple of years that I served, that was the case. For the first time, really, I believe that in the Senate at least, we were very participatory in the budgeting process. And so from the very beginning of the session, we had some priorities, we had some things that we weren't willing to negotiate on. Then we had the areas where we knew we were going to have to work on. That's increasing revenues for the state. And then finally, we knew we were going to have to write a budget that balanced at the end of the day. Or that at least we hope it gets close to balancing, and that our revenue projections are accurate moving forward, because it is just based on our best guess of what we think we're going to have available to spend next year. I'm the vice chair of the Health and Human Services Sub-Appropriations Committee. Senator Kim David from Wagner and I work on the 11 agencies that are budgeted through that process. And at the end, we were very pleased with how the agencies that we appropriate fared. We were very concerned originally on some pretty draconian cuts to the Medicaid program. Those did not come to bear, and in fact, they're going to be able to operate this next year without making rate cuts to our providers, unless something goes wrong with our projections, of course. And so when we were able to hold those programs harmless, the Office of Juvenile Affairs received full funding. Department of Human Services didn't receive as much as we would have liked, but it's certainly a manageable number for us to work with this year. Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services took some cuts, but they're going to be able to make internal adjustments and absorb that. So those agencies providing social services and the network of support for the most vulnerable Oklahomans really fared very well in a down year. And that was, of course, my primary concern and what I spent a lot of hours working on during the session.
Yeah.
On the House side, this has definitely been one of the most, of course I was going to say most that I've been, but since this is the only second budget I've seen, the most transparent that we've seen a budgeting process work so far. Leadership came into the session knowing with the size of the shortfall that we were facing, that they needed to be in communication with their members so we could get something passed. They set out several small working groups looking at different things from revenue raising measures to revolving funds to what we can cut, what we can live with, things like that. They've reported back to the caucus throughout session, and then of course the chairs and vice chairs of all the A and B subcommittees continue to meet. And this year, for the first time, the Appropriation and Budget Chair for the House, Representative Sears, met every Thursday morning with any House member that wanted to come, listen to input, things like that. So it was a very open process. Yes, it did get rolled out the last couple days of session, like it always does, but it was a very open process that all the House members had a say in all the way through. We had our own set of priorities, things that we wanted to see done this year, and things we wanted to see protected. The difficulty becomes when you want to protect against provider rate cuts, and you want to hold common education harmless and things like that. A big portion of your budget is held tight there, so you have to look at raising revenues through other means, and looking at some deeper cuts through certain things. I'm vice chair of the Natural Resources and Regulatory Services Subcommittee, which oversees a lot of, that's a horrible title, I know. It oversees a lot of smaller agencies, the Department of Ag and the Corporation Commission among them, but in terms of total dollars, there's not just a whole lot there. Compared to where it could have been, our cuts to those agencies, things like the Conservation Commission, the Department of Ag, were better than expected. The Corporation Commission, with their ongoing struggles to try to get a hold on and kind of a handle on some of the seismicity problems we had, we were able to hold flat, which I think is a big step in the right direction. In an ideal world, we'd like to maybe give them a little more money so we could we could work on some things. This year, just the ability to hold something flat was a big step forward. So all in all, it's probably not the perfect budget. None of them are, but it was the best deal we could negotiate this year. I truly believe.
Started in a hole too, 1.3 billion, the shortest. I mean, that's the largest ever. A lot of that with the energy crisis, and hopefully maybe the energy companies have learned, oil companies have learned, when $150 barrels are good. Is there something that the state maybe has learned or put in that when the good years are there, maybe we can hold back for years like this?
We actually did pass a measure that will take those volatile revenue sources and peel some of it off the top and put it away into, ironically, we also, those of us that haven't been around for a long time realized how kind of ridiculous the cap on the rainy day fund is, because we've actually capped our savings account in years past. We didn't address that. We hope to, moving forward, we'll make some changes there. And there were several things when it comes to revenue that we didn't get done this year that it may wind up being a blessing in disguise, because it does leave us. We've now started those conversations. Nothing happens very quickly in the legislative process, and some of these are big ideas. And now we have the interim to kind of hash over those ideas, do a little bit of research on them, come back next session, knowing that we need to continue to look at modernizing our tax structure as a state and then stabilizing our income. When you're a low property tax state, and Oklahoma is a very low property tax state, you're going to have volatile income because those other sources of revenue, income tax and sales tax, go up and down. They fluctuate with the health of the economy. If we're going to keep property taxes in the state low, which our taxpayers tell us is important to them, we've got to make some changes in the way we keep money set aside for whenever we know those volatile revenues drop, because they're going to. They always do. We have a cyclical environment, economy, and because of just we're relying on the environment and energy industry, and we've got to do a better job of preparing for it so we can respond accordingly.
And I think that's one of the things that's really kind of jumped out at me over the past 2 years, and it's something I know in the House we started talking about. Some of the new leadership coming up, is that Oklahoma has always been a very shallow but broad tax base. As the years have progressed, we haven't broadened any. We've continued to stay shallower, and in certain points gotten shallower than we possibly should have, but we hadn't broadened out like the states around us have. And I think that's something, our tax code as a whole hasn't been kind of looked at or overhauled since the 1930s, and our economy's changed dramatically since the 1930s. And I think that's something that we need to look at. I know during Governor Keating's time, it's something they looked at. There wasn't the political will there to do it. I think that with the revenue problems we've seen this year, I think we're going to see more of an effort to go and look at different streams of revenue to try to stabilize kind of our tax collections as a whole.
Another big part of the budget, obviously, education. A lot of common education things have come up. Even as it wrapped up toward the end of the last session, but you guys' overall thoughts on the education and how it panned out?
Wish we probably could have given them a little bit more, but it was also overall, it is, Common Ed, we spend the most of our money on it. We just do, and it is kind of a fixed cost. In fact, it's an escalating cost, and as we have been able to appropriate more and more tax dollars to education over the years, the schools don't really feel those because they are gobbled up by some of these other fixed costs. The cost of teachers' health insurance, and we look at the percentage of our tax revenues that are now being spent to provide health care to teachers and other state employees. That continues to grow and get larger. Same issue that our corporations are dealing with. So I would give us about a C since we're talking education funding.
Yeah.
When it comes to education funding, I'd give us a C. But otherwise, when we talk about education policy, it was actually a pretty good year, and we responded to a lot of things we were hearing from educators that what they said they wanted, and we were able to respond by reducing some testing requirements and giving them some additional flexibility in the dollars that they do have.
Yeah, in instruction was a big deal.
A very big deal, and addressing that, the TLE, the way we evaluate teachers, putting that back in the hands of the local schools, really big wins in terms of what we could accomplish in education policy this year. On the budget standpoint, some of the things, again, I wish we could have done more. The budget limitations being what they were, it was the best case scenario we could actually have. I know in the newspapers the last couple of weeks or last week or so, it's came out that we moved money out of the textbook funds and put it into general revenue, things like that, and they're very upset about that, and rightfully so. The reason that decision was made to do that way was to give it, to put it back in the general revenue fund and run it through the school funding formula, so the schools could use that funds as they deem necessary, and it wouldn't be necessarily earmarked for specific things. We've always been a big proponent of local control, getting the money back to the people who make the decisions. Anytime we can take those earmarks off and put them back to where our local administrations can use that money is so much the better. Regardless of what's necessarily been reported, I have friends that were in the meetings. That was not a behind closed door kind of deal. It was openly told to the State Department of Education. They knew that was coming. That was a deal that they had been working on for months and got put out there that way because they wanted local administrators to have better control of their money.
That's, not looking into it. It looks like 38 or 33 million was taken from this and put into the formula, where a lot of, I think 30 schools are not on the state formula, 72 are partially, and so not all students are going to get that. And then it was just, Jolly was saying one thing, and Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister was saying something. Ultimately, the $38 million cut was made, according to Hoffmeister.
Well, it was moved.
It was moved.
It was
correct.
moved. And I want to add, it's important that everybody realize too, I mentioned this to some of my educators, we just approved the new standards. And so in order to have the state textbook committee go through those new standards, and Sherlyn Maltz, 8th grade math teacher here in Guthrie, I just had the pleasure, in fact the honor of recently helping her be appointed to the state textbook committee. They haven't yet met. I mean, they meet this month to look at the new math standards that were just approved by the legislature and to go through the textbooks that are available and let Mrs. Maltz use her paperclip technique to determine which textbooks align the best with the new standards. So I kind of hope that districts will just kind of take a pause, wait till that committee of experts has an opportunity to do their work. Then they can start to look at doing their local textbook selections after the state textbook committee makes their recommendations. So another thing to consider is this isn't the ideal time to be buying new textbooks anyway.
Right. Is the education movement, is it going backwards or is it going frontwards, you think, in Oklahoma?
Depends on who you talk to,
Yeah.
I think. I actually think right now that anytime educators are in the driver's seat, that's moving us in the right direction. And so when we began to, again, listen to what our teachers and our school administrators were telling us at the state capitol, instead of education policy being driven by elected officials who may or may not have experience in the classroom with actual kids, I think that puts us moving in the right direction. But it is important that we also maintain a commitment to excellent standards and making sure that our kids are getting a world-class education, regardless of which of the 400 or 500 and some odd school districts in the state of Oklahoma they attend.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to point out, I think it's important when we're talking kind of education policy, we have to continue to receive our federal funds. We have to continue to do certain things within our schools to receive those funds. After they redid the No Child Left Behind, and I forget what they're calling it now, but it allowed us...
Every student achieves.
Every student achieves, yes. And every time they redo it, they change the name.
Yeah.
But it's allowed us to take some more control back to the states and then put some more control back in the local schools. And so for a long time, and part of it, we tried to manage schools from 23rd and Lincoln, and that's never a good idea. And we've rolled back some of those mandates that we've set. In turn, the federal government has backstepped some of the mandates that were laid out in No Child Left Behind, and it's laid us to kind of trickle on down and improve things. But we have to, things are getting better. It's just a slow process of change sometimes.
A lot of education questions. I know you're a former teacher, your parents were teachers, so you guys are close to it because you see both sides of it. It's just, I got to hurt you a little bit to see so all these cuts, teachers being cuts, larger classrooms, all that stuff. That's why.
Well, it's important.
Frustrating.
One of the things I want to make sure everybody realizes too, that whether a school succeeds or fails is determined by the local patrons. That's who should be telling us whether they're pleased or displeased with the local school. And whenever we started to accumulate control over education at the state capitol, one of the things that goes along with that is whenever things aren't going well, then you also accumulate the blame.
Right.
I know that this legislature, moving forward, we want to maintain that local control so that the communities are telling us what they need. And I always tell educators, especially when it comes to funding, I really want to know what it costs to provide a quality education. And that shouldn't be, whether it's a per pupil a dollar amount, or somehow tell us what it costs, and then we'll work to try to hit that number. But we also need our local individuals, the local families, and the local school boards to make sure that we're getting what the taxpayers are paying for, because that happens at the local level.
Healthcare, I know you had some success with some of the things that you authored as well, Senator Griffin. Talk about the healthcare as far as the success that you had, and plus the budget part of it.
Well, at one point during the session, they were talking 25% budget cuts or rate cuts to the Medicaid program.
Which you quickly denied.
Which I told you at the time
denied.
would not happen,
Yeah.
and it didn't. The Oklahoma Healthcare Authority actually received really state government's only significant increase in funding, which is necessary just through the growth of the Medicaid program. It's important because it pays for a couple of things that people really, really want us to do in the state of Oklahoma, and that's provide hospitals all across the state and keep our rural hospitals available, and otherwise to pay for long-term care for our elderly population, and to make sure that those nursing homes that allow people to stay in their home community and receive that nursing care at the end of their life close to home, and they will also not be receiving any cuts in the rates moving forwards. And so, obviously we immediately started working on what's going to happen next year, because the costs are going to continue to grow, and we're going to have to respond as a state. We did a couple of other things protecting some other Medicaid programs that are outside of the Healthcare Authority, primarily at the Department of Human Services, that provide support services for the elderly through the Advantage Waiver Program, and that's a support program that allows people to live in their own home as long as possible. And then our developmental disability community, making sure that we have community services available for individuals that are raising a child with a disability or caring for an adult child with a disability. So all in all, we prioritized as a legislature vulnerable Oklahomans, and that was reflected in the budget.
And I definitely think that's probably the biggest win of all this session, and the best thing to come out of this budget was that we stood up as a legislative body and said we will not accept rate cuts like this, and came together and found a way to do it, whether it was raising revenue in different means or cutting government in other sides. We pulled together and made that happen.
Another part of the budget we see across the state, we've seen a lot of success here in Logan County, is ODOT and county commissioners. We have the highway project on 35 going through Logan County right now, the Guthrie part. Highway 33 was revamped, rehabilitated, I think is the correct word. And of course the viaduct that continues on, the utilities being moved now. But what do you say for ODOT? Because I go to these county commissioner meetings and they talk about, all the divisions they have to go through and legislation and all that good stuff. But talk about the ODOT part.
I think the main thing to remember, especially when dealing with county commissioners and county roads and things like that, is they do not have a funding source outside the state to deal with county roads. That money has to go to Oklahoma City and then funnel back down to them. Something I didn't realize when I used to call and yell at my county commissioner for my road not being graded. Sorry, Monty. And so I think that is important to realize that their budgets for dealing with roads completely funnels through the state. We were able to do some bonding this year for long-term capital improvement projects to stay on track with the 8-year plan. And I think ODOT's done an exceptional job of setting up the 8-year plan. It's allowed us to lower cost while building roads and bridges. I think other state agencies could take kind of a page out of ODOT's playbook and say, this is what we want to do over the next couple of years, and allows you to move forward. And then it gives you a place to negotiate with in terms of budget negotiations, because you can actually show people, all right, if we cut ODOT's money this much, this is how many projects is going to be affected across the state. So I think the 8-year plan's done a tremendous amount for improving Oklahoma's roads and bridges. The CIRB fund, basically the County Road and Bridge Fund, took a little bit of a hit this year. It was part of a negotiated deal that left the rest of the county courthouse money in place. They knew it was coming. They were okay with it. County roads and bridges are extremely important to rural Oklahoma. I live 4 miles down a dirt road, and when rains come and stuff like that, you have to be able to get in and out, especially this time of year when they're seeing tractors and balers and combines and trucks and everything rolling over them. So our county commissioners do a good job of trying to keep those roads in place and face pretty tough job with the amount of money they have to work with. So I think all in all, the bonding issue, I know it's something there was a little bit of tension between the House and Senate at times on how much to bond, which is the way things should go, checks and balances. But we're able to reach an agreement. We have some bonds. And just like nobody likes to take on debt, debt for long-term improvements, building a house, owning a car, things like that are acceptable. In the past, national rating agencies have actually downgraded Oklahoma's transportation bonds because we don't do enough of them. Other states will actually bond out the totality of their Department of Transportation budgets, which allows them to kind of know where they're going to receive higher bond ratings. We don't do that here in Oklahoma. So we have some bonds that we're able to keep on track and stay with the plan.
Yeah, roads are so big in county, but also bridges. And Oklahoma as a state is not very good at bridges, but there's a lot of, in your neck of the woods up in Monty, as you mentioned, District 3 has a lot of bridge issues as well, but hopefully that's coming soon. Senator Griffin, you mentioned the Rainy Day Fund, which helped out education, also helped out Department of Corrections, and it looks like that went for the most part as well as it could go.
And corrections, of course, we kept the funding flat. Everybody needs to realize that public safety has to be a priority. And when we talk about corrections funding, that funding isn't really to benefit the inmate, it's to benefit the staff.
Right.
And those correction officers that are taking care of those prisoners, because budget cuts can reduce their safety. And so that was a priority as well. If you remember, throughout the session, we've talked about what we thought would happen, and we were going to maintain our commitment to our infrastructure. We also talked about pensions, and we're going to maintain our commitment to making sure our pension systems are healthy, because that's an indicator of the long-term financial health of the state, and we did that. And we'll continue to put additional money into teachers' retirement and the state employees' retirement fund so that they stay on equal footing. Whereas years past, if this were the mid-'80s when we had a downturn, we'd just go make a withdrawal from the teachers' retirement system. There was no way we were going to do that. And we said that we would maintain our commitment to Common Ed, to healthcare, and to corrections as the 3 priorities in funding. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what the budget looked like.
And that's been, you mentioned kind of the mid-'80s. That was my big question over the last couple of years is, we didn't put money into pensions. We didn't necessarily maintain our road infrastructure. Where did all the money go? And I still haven't got a good answer. But in the last 10 years, there's really been a concerted effort with the implementation of the 8-year road plan, with the implementation of off-the-top money to go into firming up our pension systems. So we're not eventually in a situation like Michigan is, where we have to go back on our word and negotiate with retirees. Our pension systems are on a lot firmer footing now than they were 10 years ago. We still have some issues with corrections. We have a new interim deputy or director of corrections. So I think we're going to see some turnaround there on some things that have not been enforced as heavily, and some missed opportunities that I think we can see turned around on. So we really are making a concerted effort on some things that have kind of fallen through the wayside and through the cracks in the past, 5, 10, well, not 5, 10, 20, 30, 100 years that we haven't done. It just takes a little bit longer when things have been neglected as they have been.
Still talking about budget, still on here. Is there anything that that went under the radar as far as media that you guys are proud of, kind of disappointed with as far as the budget goes?
Well, and we talk about education funding, and we just talk about Common Ed primarily, but, career technology,
Yes.
they took small cuts, and higher ed took the largest cut in state government. I think a lot of that has to do with just the legislature and the governor have almost no control over what happens within higher education. We literally write one big check to the regents, and then the regents spend the money. And they determine how much the major four-year universities get. They also, are funding a lot of the smaller regional universities, which have kind of been shortchanged over the last several years. And so a lot of folks think that those cuts are made at the legislature, and we're deciding if OU and OSU get the big chunk of the money. It's not the case. The state regents actually are in charge of that. And it's important also to remember there's a lot of what happens. We're dealing with macro numbers, with the big number for the agency. Once the money gets to the agency, unless we do what we call budget limit bills, and that's direct to an agency how to spend their money, then we don't have any further control. So each of those agencies is responsible for writing the final budget. The only agency that received a budget limit bill this year was the Department of Human Services, and we lined item some specific funding to protect those core services within that agency. So whenever it gets there, we don't have that much control over it. And then with higher education, we have almost none.
And the governor appoints those regions, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
And many of them stay on for a really long time.
Yeah.
And of my, we talk about disappointments. I think that's because of the way things have gone through the regents. The cuts to our smaller regional and community colleges, I think are going to be tough, and it's something I would have liked to have seen fixed. But unfortunately, like the senator said, it's one check, and they choose how it goes out. And I think that's something we hopefully would like to address in the future.
Yeah.
We'll try to get away from the budget. I'm sure we might slip back into the budget and say this, but talking about individuals, I know you had a lot of success with the autism deal, and there's a couple other ones that you had to be proud of, Senator Griffin.
That was, of course, the highlight of the year for me was being able to join the other states that are requiring our insurance companies to provide meaningful coverage to kids with autism. We will spend, just passing the legislation doesn't mean it's over, though, because we'll now spend the interim working on establishing an appropriate credentialing system so that we know that the people providing those services are qualified to do that. We're also going to look at how that coverage for our children who receive their care through Medicaid, which is about a third of the children in the state of Oklahoma, how we're going to be able to implement that and having the right practitioners to provide those services for those children. We had a couple of big wins in the area of juvenile justice. One in particular limits how we use the detention system for kids that get in trouble. We have young people who commit minor crimes that wind up penetrating the juvenile justice system much too far, and it actually winds up making their behavioral issues worse. And so we wanted to put an end to that practice. We don't want to send kids to a detention facility because somebody got mad at them. Right. It should actually be a punishment that fits the level of their crime. And so was very, very pleased to be able to do that. And then at the end of the year, had something come up unexpected whenever, because of a decision of the courts, we discovered we had a problem in our sodomy laws, forcible sodomy, that left a loophole for not protecting individuals who might be unconscious. We were able to close that loophole and at the same time actually add some language that gives Oklahoma some very good consent laws moving forward to help protect Oklahomans from being the victim of rape or sexual assault, and if they are, give prosecutors the tool to make sure that those individuals are prosecuted and hopefully sentenced to more than 6 months.
Did an attorney find that loophole?
Yes, actually, that loophole was found by a defense attorney.
Yeah.
And the decision of the court was correct based on the way the statute was written, although it was not correct whenever you use common sense.
Right.
But that was one of those things, whenever the legislature has to, we need to be able to move really quickly. And I'm glad that we found out about that while we were still in session, and we were able to close that loophole. So I was very proud to be able to help Representative Scott Biggs with that piece of legislation.
Probably my biggest legislative achievement this year was passing a cattle rustling bill, something that we haven't been able to do in a few years. The statute to deal with cattle rustling hasn't necessarily kept up with the times. Again, kind of a leftover from the 30s and sat there and not touched a whole lot. The price of cattle has went up dramatically since then. And with the ever-increasing presence of illegal drugs in our communities, we're seeing a lot more cattle theft. It's becoming a lot more common. Basically, this would give the prosecutors more tools to prosecute cattle rustling cases and implement a higher fine system to try to provide some recompense for the farmers and ranchers. Interestingly enough, up in Kay County, they just had a case, I think it was 25 to 35 head just got stolen. That they just caught the individual. So this is an ongoing crime, and it's something that it kind of ebbs and flows, but we're definitely seeing an uptick in cattle rustling here lately. Another big thing I think that I got passed out was a Senate bill that I actually got passed in the House. Deals with aquifer recharge, and as we move forward with our Water for 2060 plans to try to conserve and reuse as much water as we can, the ability to set forth the set of rules to start looking at aquifer recharge, actually refilling these underground aquifers so that we can come back and redraw it out later, I think is going to be huge in the implementation of that. Texas does it. Wichita, Kansas has been doing it for years. Oklahoma just needs to be able to set forth some rules, some limitations, and things like that as we move forward. But in the long-term kind of water conservation scope of things, I think that's going to be have a really big impact in the future. I know it's hard to think about that when we're getting rain here every couple of weeks, right. But we just got out of a really big drought. I'm sure we'll see another one, and we still have to continue to move forward with Oklahoma's water policy.
Got local races here in June, the commissioner race and the sheriff's race here in Logan County. November, we've got some state questions coming up. I believe the alcohol thing will be there. Anything else that we might see in November?
There will be several state questions on the ballot, and probably in November, unless some of them are actually pushed to the August ballot with a runoff ballot, just because there are the sheer number of them. So everybody just needs to pay attention. And if you have, we won't tell you how to vote on those, or I won't tell you how to vote, but I will explain what it means.
Absolutely.
And I do think we're going to see a lot of them. President Bourne's penny sales tax proposal, the right to farm, State Question 777, the alcohol redoing of the Constitution, and actually one that's coming up that's dealing with making possession of a narcotic misdemeanor, and it's not just limited to marijuana or anything like that. It's any illegal narcotics, heroin, methamphetamine. Date rape, drugs, anything like that would make it a misdemeanor. So it'll be a very full ballot.
And then after you guys are out of the legislature, probably think it'll move on to next. But the OHP with their card reading system, I know that's getting a lot of headlines too. And they had a press conference yesterday trying to explain what they do. That's another thing that you guys might get involved with. You think?
Well, and I'm sure we'll look at that legislatively. The legislation regarding civil assets and the use of seizing those assets by law enforcement was reviewed last year. It didn't get very far. I think it's one of those things that we need to study as a state and listen to constituents, get the feedback, and also talk to law enforcement agencies. I think it's a tool of law enforcement that, depending on the ethics of the individual using it can be used wisely, and it can also be abused, just like any other government power that can be used. But we've already started, and literally the day after session's over, you sit down and start cleaning out the desk and start making the list for the next session, what things we're going to address. And I know that I've already got interim studies requested. We'll be looking at some innovations in social services because we know that budget woes are constant. I was really glad this year that we weren't Louisiana. They had a $2 billion budget shortfall. Alaska was wrestling with a $4 billion budget shortfall in a state that relies even more heavily on the energy industry than the state of Oklahoma. Practically, they were shaving 2/3 out of their state's budget, so this was not ideal, but it quite frankly could have been much worse.
You kind of touched on it. What do you, as a legislator, what do you do now, getting ready till the next session, what's those steps?
Oh, I know what John's doing right now. He's farming.
Yeah, a lot of farming, which is good and bad, because it gives me lots of times on the tractor, so I think a lot.
Yeah.
And I write things down, and after dark we go home and we start figuring out what we need to look at, what we need to do to pursue next session. Definitely continuing updating our tax code is something I've really started to look at. Water policy, where we at, where do we go, and just figuring out what we need to look at, what we need to study, and what bills we're going to file next year.
A lot of research, I would think, would be taking place and then hitting them hard when it comes to the next session. So
Yes, it is.
we appreciate you guys talking out through the entire process. I don't know if a lot of senators or representatives get out and talk like you guys have done with us here on this show, and I know I got a lot of great feedback from it, and I appreciate you guys' time and enjoyed it this year.
Tell people, everyone, now's the time to bring us your ideas, because
Yes.
now we can get them. We can start working on them. Don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's too late in February.
Right.
Senator Griffin, thank you. Representative Pfeiffer, thank you very much. That concludes the last edition of the Roundup. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you next year.